space or in your garden. So first off, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Tanya Shear, and I'm the school program manager at Gateway Greening. Gateway Greening has been around since 1984 when we gained our 501c3 status. Our mission is to empower the community, educate and empower the community through gardening and urban agriculture. So if you're familiar with us, we have many projects that are in our network of gardens. So you can see the map to the right shows all of the different orchards, youth gardens, and community gardens that are part of the Gateway Greening Network. So we have over 200 projects in our network. We also have a land trust program, and we have 17 land trust projects. We also do many webinars and offer free workshops for the community. So to kind of start this off, I wanted to acknowledge where I am, the land that I am on. So I know there are probably many of you tuning in from all over, maybe not just St. Louis, but here in St. Louis, it is the land of the Osage Nation. So I would like to respectfully acknowledge that we're hosting this webinar on the ancestral lands of the Osage Nation. The process of knowing and acknowledging the land that we're on is a way of honoring it and expressing gratitude for the ancestral Osage people who are on this land before us. So I would like to thank them for the active management of the land. And this land continues to carry the stories of those people and their struggles for survival and identity. As an organization dedicated to connecting individuals to the land, their food, and each other, we think it is imperative that we remember and acknowledge the people's nations that came before us. So land acknowledgements are things that you can incorporate with your students. You can do this when you're out in the garden space. You can even do it with staff at meetings. If you're not sure the native land that you're on, there's a really great app, and I will show you that here. It's called the Native Land app. And it's a map where you can put in your address, and it will show you the indigenous territories that were on that land. You can also look up, you can see in the corner where you can filter through languages or even look at different treaties. So let's see, I'll just search Belleville, Illinois. So if you put the address in, you see I have territories marked off, and it will show you the different tribes. Let's see if I can zoom out a little. So you can see Kickapoo. It'll show you all the different territories that were here. Oops, you can see that. I'm gonna zoom out so you can kind of see how that varies. And if I wanted, I could click on treaties. Let's see, take that off. And then you can also see and click on different treaties for that territory. So it's a really cool feature. And I highly encourage you adopt the land acknowledgement at your school or place of employment. If you want to know more about land acknowledgements, the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, so USDAC, has a really great guide on land acknowledgements and how you can kind of put one together. So I highly encourage that. Okay. So just to talk a little bit about this session, some of the goals. Basically, again, I already mentioned we're going to talk about different ways you can incorporate multicultural learning into your outdoor space. But if you're not familiar with the term cultural relevancy, I think in the education field, most of us have probably heard that quite a bit, but if you're not, basically it just means teaching in a cross-cultural or multicultural setting. It's encouraging students to relate their learning to their own cultural context. So cultural relevancy in your learning should empower students, not just intellectually, but also emotionally, socially, and even politically. So when we think about politically in terms of the garden or food, we hear a lot about food justice. So one thing that you can do with your students is a perspective walk, and you can come up with your own set of questions. But one thing you can kind of kick off and to introduce the concept of food justice is just by having them, oops, I don't know how that switched, by having students stand on one side and ask them to walk to the right side if they can relate to the question. So you could start off by asking, do they currently live within walking distance to a grocery store? And if they do, they can walk to the other side. And you could ask them if they currently live within walking distance to a farmer's market. You can also ask them if they currently live within walking distance to a community garden. So this is just to kind of set the tone and put things into perspective so they can realize that not everyone has that easy access, and that it is sadly a privilege and also an injustice that not everyone has these healthy food choices nearby, or may not have transportation to drive to a grocery store. So that's just kind of one way you can introduce the idea of food justice. And you can also connect that to food deserts if you want to teach your students a little more about that. The Missouri Coalition for the Environment, if you are in the St. Louis area, has a great map that I will show you. And it highlights the different food deserts in St. Louis. So let's see. You can see the darker red areas indicate, let's see, you can see the key over here, indicate areas that are low income and beyond a half mile from a supermarket. So over 60% in these dark red areas. So you could use this map to kind of, again, introduce the idea of food justice or food injustices and food deserts, and why it really is empowering to know how to grow their own food. Because if you don't have that, those options, you likely only have unhealthy options to eat. You know, if you're getting your food from a convenience store, you're not going to have as many choices as others would. So that's why it's even more empowering to know how to grow your own food and to have that school garden. I go too far? Okay. So before we start, I'm going to talk today about 4 different things you can do to incorporate culturally relevant learning in your garden and community kind of centered learning. But first, I just want to talk about why gardens and why do we want them to be culturally relevant. So I think that garden is actually one of the best places to incorporate this. One, because food is kind of a universal thing we can all agree on. You know, it doesn't matter where you come from, what your background is, everyone has to eat, right? So it's something that unites us all. Also, I like to think of nature as just being a really great metaphor for, well, even just human life. So when you think about a garden, a healthier garden is going to have a lot of biodiversity. The more insects you have and different types of plants, the healthier that ecosystem is going to be. And it's the same with the planet. When we think about the more diversity we have on our planet, it makes it stronger and healthier. I also like, you know, the metaphor of thinking about plants. When in the gardening world, we talk about if you're growing seedlings, starting seeds inside, you have to harden those plants off. So you have to, you know, put them outside for a few hours so they can adjust to the changing climate, and it makes them stronger. So thinking about like plants can become stronger, more resilient, you know, as they adapt to the environment or to storms or weather. And, you know, humans are the same way. We can become stronger, you know, as we have different life experiences. So I think nature is just a great metaphor altogether. And yeah, I can really stress the importance of biodiversity in the garden. It's also important to have cultural relevancy in the garden, because having a lack of diversity within agricultural spaces can lead to a lack of inclusion and also non-white cultural representation in the agricultural field. So it's important that students, you know, are learning about people that are like them, they can identify with in agriculture. So the first thing I want to talk about that you can do in your garden or outdoor space is getting to know your students and their families well. That should be your first goal. So first, you want to really think about that not all of your students are maybe going to have positive connections to nature. And that could be for many reasons. You know, it could be historically, you know, we know that obviously slavery, you know, is not a positive connection when you're thinking of farming. But there's also a lot of positive connections to nature too. And a book, and I'll mention all my resources at the end, but a book that I found really helpful is called Rooted in the Earth. And I know it's kind of hard to find the actual copy, but you can get a PDF of it pretty easy online. But it is Reclaiming the African American Environmental Heritage. And the author, Diane Glave, she does a really good job of talking about both positive and negative connections to nature and to the outdoors and farming historically with African American culture. So I highly recommend checking that book out. But just thinking of all of your students, how they're all bringing their own experiences, and they might not all be positive. So addressing those, you know, in the beginning. Also giving students activities that teach them about their culture and celebrate it. I was working at a school doing gardening classes that had a very high population of English as second language learners. And I wanted to really find out, you know, what kind of foods are they eating at home? So we wouldn't just have the same old stuff growing in the garden. So I started out by having them do a journal entry where they could draw pictures and write about foods that their family cook at home a lot. So that kind of gave me some ideas on different things we could incorporate to the garden. It's also really important to get parent feedback. You know, you can grow as much eggplant in a garden as you want, but if those families don't know how to cook with eggplant or they don't eat it, then you're going to have a lot of wasted eggplant. So it's really important to reach out to the families and find out what kind of things do they want to see growing in the garden. So one way you could do this is by tabling at an open house or at a parent-teacher conference, setting up a table, and you could just simply have a list where families can come and just write down different crops they would like to see in the garden that they would use. But you could also, if there is a language barrier with families, you could also do your own research a little bit and maybe put pictures of these different crops and just to make it simple where they come up and they take a sticker and stick it underneath, you know, a picture of a crop that they like to use or would like to see in the garden. So there are lots of different ways that you can get feedback. You know, you could even send something home with students, but it's really important to, you know, bring in the family's culture and find out, you know, what kind of different vegetables and fruits do they cook with that you could potentially grow in your garden. So that being said, you may think that a lot of things, you know, if you have multicultural school, then you may think a lot of things that, you know, some of the families might like to cook with, we might not be able to grow here. But surprisingly, there are a lot of multicultural crops that do grow well in St. Louis. And I'll show you a list in just a minute. But this is an example of what we have done at our demonstration garden, at Gateway Greening's demonstration garden on Bell. We have different regional beds. So you can see we have a Middle East Mediterranean bed, Central North American, Sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia, South Asia. And I will show you a list of some of the different crops that we've grown in these beds. And these are all okay for Missouri's zone. So if you live in Missouri, you can grow pretty much all of these things. So I'm just going to kind of scroll through it. I know it's a lot, but again, this is being recorded. So you will have the ability to go back later, excuse me, and pause and kind of look through this again. I can also email it out if you'd like. So this just gives you some ideas of different crops, excuse me, that you could grow here in St. Louis that can represent different cultures and regions. You know, we grew sesame in our regional beds one year, and it was really fun for me to see, you know, even where sesame seeds come from, just to see the way the plant grows and to be able to come up and just crack open a pod and you have sesame seeds. But a lot of things that, you know, we don't typically grow in our gardens that we could be growing. Get away from the same old crops. So once you've really gotten to know your students and the families, well, it's important that you focus on creating a strong class community. So lots of different ways you can do this. There are lots of icebreakers that you can use. You know, start off with some good icebreakers that allow students to really get to know each other, to find their similarities. You can always do, it's Mingo, which is like a bingo where they have to go around and find someone else in the room. You have different things about students and they have to find someone who has something in common and they can check it off. You could even just kind of pair up students and have them find 3 things they have in common. You could also do a community web activity. So if anyone, some of you may be familiar with a food web activity where you get the class in a circle and you have a roll of yarn and you start with something down at the bottom of the food chain. So you may say, the teacher could start and you could say, I'm a kale plant, and you have the end of your yarn, and then you call in another student in the circle to say something that eats kale, and then you pass the roll of yarn to them. You continue holding on to the end of it. They say, something that eats the kale, and they hold on to that part of the string and then pass the yarn to someone else who then says something that, would eat that, whether it's an insect. And then you can go on, to a bird, and you kind of see this web being created with the yarn. And then you can talk about, well, what would happen if we just removed that one insect? If there were none of these, say an ant, if there were no ants, we remove that. And then you tell the students, anyone that feels a tug on their yarn whenever that one is removed, they have to then let go. So if we're removing the insect, the person who said insect and is holding that part of the yarn lets go. Well, of course, then that creates, a little tug or tension for the bird, and then, whatever ate the bird. So eventually everything else is gone. They all have to let go. So you realize how just removing that one little insect will then affect all these other things who rely on the insect or the bird, and so on. But you can also do this with your community. So you could kind of create a web thinking about all the important parts that make up a healthy school or a community. But you could maybe have someone start with, what's something that's essential for a school to function? And of course, a student. So maybe they hold on to the end of the string and then pass it to someone else who has to say something that's essential for a school to function. And the first thing that might come to mind is students, teachers, a principal, but you can also bring up the fact, get them thinking, well, who keeps the building, clean so that you're not getting sick? Because if you're sick, you can't come to school, so then we bring in the custodial staff and how important that role is. And, thinking about, well, if your basic needs aren't met, you aren't going to be able to function, well enough to learn. So of course we have to have our cafeteria staff, and our cooks, so that way we can eat, and, our school nurse, and you can kind of then create a web to see how important all these pieces are for the school community. Again, you can do that with other settings too, even just thinking about your community as a whole. So that's another thing that you can do to kind of help create that strong class community. You can also, so I'll probably reference a few times Soul Fire Farm. There's another great book by the founders of Soul Fire Farm, Leah Penniman. It's called Farming While Black. This book has lots of resources for culturally relevant learning. You can also go to their website and they have some activities, but they have the Soul Fire Farm Youth Food Justice Pledge. So you could have your class as a whole create their own food justice pledge and, post that somewhere. So this is an example of the one from Soul Fire Farm, but you could create one of those as a class. Also providing students with lots of opportunities for internal and external reflection. So I love to bring mindfulness into the garden. There are so many ways we can practice mindfulness in the garden. And it could be something as simple as, just a little meditation. You could take just a few minutes at the beginning of your garden class or whatever class you're doing outside to maybe read a little poem and have students close their eyes. You could even have them do some reflective journaling, maybe about the poem or just whatever they're feeling. One of my favorite mindfulness activities is to create nature mandalas. So you can talk about connectedness, however deep you want to go into it, but you could talk about how other cultures, how you have the mandala to represent balance and connectedness and unity. So you could give students a task of creating a nature mandala and just let them know that it just has to be balanced. So they can find, you can see some examples here, different items they can find around the schoolyard. And another great lesson that comes from mandalas is impermanence. So, they're putting all this work into creating this beautiful nature mandala, And well, it also teaches patience if you try doing it on a windy day, I'll tell you that. But they put all this time and effort into this, and it's beautiful, but it's not going to last. So it's a great way to kind of teach about impermanence and just appreciating it for the moment. You know, you can keep them there, and next time you're out, see kind of how they've changed, maybe how some of the items have weathered, or maybe the wind's just blown them away. But again, it kind of teaches just being mindful in the moment, enjoying the beauty, even if it will not last. Let's see. Some other opportunities for internal and external reflection. One thing you could do is create, it's called 4 Elements, and I believe this comes from Seeds of Solidarity. It's an organization. They also have some activities you can find online. It's the 4 Elements activity, and you can create ahead of time signs that represent each element. So fire, air, earth, and water, and you can put some different like characteristics under those. So fire could say opinionated and passionate, you know, whereas water could be emotional. And let's see, earth could be grounded. Which one am I for? Oh, air could be easygoing or imaginative. You can put some different characteristics that are represented by those elements, and then ask students to really think about, you know, which one do they identify with as far as their outer self, the side of them that everyone sees, and have them stand by that element. And then have them do a little reflection as far as, you know, what are the challenges of, you know, maybe being fire and being passionate and opinionated, and also how is that a good thing, and how can they support the good side of having that quality. And then have them think more, well, what is their internal self, the side that maybe we don't all see, you know, so maybe are really passionate and opinionated, but maybe on the inside, you know, you're a little more emotional, so you're a little more like water. So just a way for them to kind of have some internal and external reflection on themselves and kind of express themselves. And you may even try this activity more than once and see that, you know, maybe these things change for one student. Maybe one day they're feeling more, you know, passionate and opinionated, and the next day they're feeling a little more imaginative, a little more, you know, like air. So that's another thing you can do. You can also do, there's an activity called Representing Me. I believe that comes from Soul Fire Farm, where you can have the students take a few minutes when they get outside to the garden or the outdoor space and have them find an object in nature that represents them. So it could be something, you know, as simple as, I found a rock because I'm strong, you know, but you could be surprised by how deep some of the students may go with it. And once they have their items, you bring them back together, they form a circle, and you have them each take an opportunity to share out why they chose that item. So also helps them to just think a little deeper about themselves and make some connections. Let's see. The third thing I want to talk about that you can do in your outdoor space for cultural relevancy is creating many opportunities for purposeful interactions with people from other cultures and the community. So just bringing in people from the community, again, people that kind of the students can identify with, maybe in the agricultural field. So this could involve you kind of finding different people, asking guest speakers to come. It's really important when you're teaching, you know, about other cultures that you're not trying to tell someone else's story. So let someone tell their story to you. So, you know, maybe there are some elders in the community that you can find that can come and talk a little bit about their connection to farming or gardening or the land, and kind of tell their own story. You could even ask the students to do interviews, maybe to reach out to folks or even to their family, have the students do interviews with their family to learn a little bit more about cultural connections with food and, or, you know, possibly gardening. You could even find, have students kind of create, create pen pals. So there's another great list also from Soul Fire Farm. They have a long list. And again, I know this is a lot, but since this is recorded, you'll have the option to go back and kind of pause and look through this list. But they have put together a really nice list on farm activists of color, as well as farm training programs led by people of color. So you could have your students maybe reach out to some of these programs. They could write letters to them, maybe even potentially you could set something up where they have kind of like pen pals that they write back and forth and can kind of learn more about what these folks are doing. And they also have organizations that work, organizations work with food, land, and freedom that are led by people of color. I think I have a typo there. But again, this comes from Soul Fire Farm, and it is in, this list is included in the Farming While Black book. So you could also do a collage activity where students choose one of these farm activists of color and they create a collage, or even just a research project to learn a little bit more. Oh, volunteering in other gardens. So that's another thing you can do. Have your students go to another garden in a different neighborhood and they can volunteer, whether it's a community garden or even a school garden. You could work something out with another school garden where they go and help out at one school, and then the other school can come and work with your students and they can kind of show off their garden and what they've done and learn a little bit from each other. So any opportunity you can get to bring in folks from the community to kind of share their story and give your students opportunity to just learn from other people or people that they might be able to identify with. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about creating intentional garden design. So you definitely want to be, of course, intentional when you're thinking about how you're going to plan your garden, whether it's a new garden or just, for the new gardening season. So this could be a student project. So it could be, again, something where students do some research and maybe learn about different historical gardening practices. So rather than just putting up a trellis to grow squash on, you could task the students with researching trellising and kind of what culture really started that practice, or look at the ways different cultures may create trellises. And you could try to recreate some of that. Also using lots of signage in the garden. So to really make your garden a learning space, you could have students do that research and then, maybe make, paint a board with information about the history of trellising, or maybe talking about a different type of trellising that maybe they've recreated based off a certain culture's practices. And you can have that information there in the garden. So when you have guests come to your garden, then they can learn a little something too. So again, just different examples of gardening practices that they could research to find out, where it started or how different people may do raised beds in different areas or intercropping and so on. Let's see. You could create a peace corner in your garden. So just having a space that's kind of, if a student's having a bad day, or kind of just a space to go and sit and just get away from everything, really trying to include a lot of sensory stuff in that space or in your garden. So lots of different colored plants and flowers, different, fun shapes, lots of herbs, so that you're really, stimulating all those senses. Also thinking about keeping it handicap accessible. So you want to be intentional with that based on, what your student body looks like. So do you need to consider having maybe Braille signage out, or maybe, just including lots of signs, for the hearing impaired. Also thinking about, do you need wheelchair accessible paths? That can be somewhat difficult to do in a garden space sometimes. If you have a lot of mulch down, that's not going to be easy to navigate with the wheelchair. I'm also thinking about, keeping it wide enough, maybe having double high beds for those folks that might be in wheelchairs or have a hard time, kind of bending or kneeling down. Lots of different ways you can modify your garden based on the needs. So you can also get like those cheap foam rolls and put those around handles to make gripping a little bit easier. You can do hanging planters that maybe you can adjust, that you can pull kind of like one cord down so that you can adjust the height of it based on the needs. Again, that could be good for someone that's in a wheelchair. let's see, I know forgetting some, but you can find a lot of these ideas online too. There's a lot of creative stuff that I've seen that people have done to make the garden space more handicap accessible. Let's see, the hope flag. So that's something kind of fun to do in your garden space. So it's kind of based off Tibetan prayer flags. So you can have students write down just different wishes or dreams they have, and then you can put these together on a prayer flag and hang that around your garden. So also when we're talking about signage, signage is great to have in the garden. This may not be what you're thinking in terms of signage, but this is also something you can do if you really want to incorporate the food justice side. So this is actually at Life Lab, who is a great resource for school gardens there in California. A coworker of mine had went there for a conference, and in their kind of youth demonstration garden, they had a lot of signage around that highlighted different folks in agriculture, different people of color, but also they had different information, signage about race and economics, the food system, and things like that. So, you may, if you're working with older students, you may, want to turn that into kind of a student project, and they can do some research and kind of post the stuff out in the garden. Also thinking of different language, putting signage in different languages that reflect the students and families that will be in that space. So that kind of sums up the 4 points I really wanted to talk about today. And I prefer to do this class in person, so we can really bring in more activities and kind of model those. But the resources that I'm going to share with you today, I think will be a great jumping off point to find actual activities that you can kind of bring into your class. But just to kind of reflect back, start by getting to know your students and families really well, learning more about their culture and what they would like to see in the garden, creating a strong sense of community with your class. So as much as you can kind of make that, stress that biodiversity metaphor, the garden and also humans, and the garden is great, and just bringing in mindful activities and ways that they can kind of express themselves, and creating lots of opportunities for them to have interaction with other folks from the community, and just being intentional in your garden design and how you want to plan your garden. So again, these are some of the resources I mentioned. The Native Land app is where you can find out the territories, the native territories that you are currently on, or you can put in any address and look that up. Also, Farming While Black is the book by Leah Penniman with Soulfire Farms. Rooted in the Earth by Diane Glave is the one that talks about African Americans' environmental heritage and different connections to the land. And I mentioned Seeds of Solidarity. You can, I think it's seedsofsolidarity.org. You can find, they have a few different youth programs. So you can find, I think they have their whole booklet that you can look at for free of different activities. And they really focus a lot on kind of the food justice side of it. And I mentioned Soulfire Farm. So I definitely recommend you check out these resources. And I'm sure a lot of you probably have some resources you can share too. So feel free to drop those in the chat or Q&A box. And I am going to, let's see, pull that up now. Does anyone have any questions or things that they would like to share? Well, I would love to see ways that you all, might be incorporating some of these ideas in your classroom. Feel free to email those to us, to Gateway Grading. And again, look for the video to be on our YouTube by the end of the day tomorrow. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great week.